So we know all the historical revelations. We know the ethnic revelations. We know the geopolitical side to this. But I believe there's another aspect here. And folks that follow the G7 and follow the WTO and the IMF and all the other insanity that goes on with US led, let's be fair, US led. We are the world reserve currency, and we leverage the IMF and the World Trade Organization and all the rest of that NGO apparatchik to freaking force our will around the world. And really, our chief export, I believe, neoliberalism, right? We love to export complete privatization. We love to export Mitt Romney's Bain Capital. We want to be that guy. And so what do? We have the WTO, or excuse me, the IMF come in and say, we're here to help. We're from the IMF. And they offer them loans to be able to help them because Ukraine has never really gotten off the ground. It's got all those resources and none of the productive capacity. They have never been able to get off their feet because they've been in constant conflict, constant war, constant shelling. It's just impossible to generate the kind of here and now industrial power it would take to be thriving on their own. So while they've got all these real resources, they are in essence captive to imports because they don't have the productive capacity to take care of themselves because of all these things. WTO and the IMF and the World Bank come in and they say, well, here's the deal. We're going to give you this money. We're going to lend you these things, but here's some structural adjustments you've got to agree to. So they've got austerity measures they're going on right now as part of their financial fiscal, getting well plan. Your get well plan includes austerity, right?
Yeah.
So they implement this. And then all the while, simultaneously, I mean, I think it's like some 3 billion, it was 2.8 billion, some ridiculous number for them anyway, in foreign US denominated debt. They can't print their way out of. There's no way for Ukraine to print their way out of that mess. That is foreign denominated debt. So now, like we did in Venezuela, and folks, if you read, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, whether it be 100% like a fact-based story or whether it be a little bit of a James Bond type thing, you can debate that. I think it's probably closer to true than not. And in this particular case, we see the IMF has got its claws deeply embedded in Ukraine right now. Ukraine, 12% of the wheat export for the entire world. They are like number one or number two and all these different real resources, like from titanium, lithium, petroleum, you name it, all corn. Oh my God, they could feed the world. In fact, Russia depends heavily on the food production of Ukraine. So with the IMF latching its claws in there, its purpose, the IMF, is to strip away the public space and literally free it up, make it better to do business, make it easier to do business, right? This is how we go to war. This is how we do all sorts of things. So I believe full-heartedly that while there's all these things going on, I believe that when you get down to it, follow the money. I think this is a money story in not even a money story, really a real resource grab, the giant sucking sound of that vacuum siphoning out the real resources from Ukraine with promises they'll make it better, but simultaneously stripping them as they've done in Africa, stripping them as they've done in South America, stripping them as they've done in Central America. So tell me what the role is of this IMF. And just the other day, the IMF came out and said, we're here to help. We're going to do even more for you, Ukraine. I see a tie-in with NATO being sort of the police bulldog for the IMF and vice versa, to impose, or at least to appear to be, protecting them, but simultaneously raping them of their real resources. Am I being hyperbolic, or is there some merit here?
I think there's definitely a lot of merit there, Steve. I think there's a kind of good news and bad news story here, or maybe there's sort of two possible good news stories depending on the outcome, of course, and one possible really bad news story. And if there's any silver lining in the current developments, it's that the worst bad news story now, I think, is less likely to succeed. So the worst bad news story, I think, is the one that you've just told, right? You've essentially got a very, very rich country in terms of the resources, both under the ground, in the ground, and sort of above the ground, and also just in the population. I mean, the Ukrainians are and immensely well-educated people on a per capita basis, and immensely creative and able people. They've got a great industrial sort of history as probably the most industrial sector or section of or portion of the old Soviet Union during its industrial heyday. And so there's a great deal of sort of human potential, a great deal of industrial potential, and then, as you noted, a great deal of resource potential. Indeed, it bears noting that one of the reasons that Hitler didn't get to Moscow during the big invasion, the Nazi invasion of Russia or the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, when they were they were like, I think, almost 2/3 of the way there within just a few weeks. But Hitler decided to divert the armies that were going to go straight on to Moscow down to take Kiev, because he said, we need this Ukraine territory first and foremost to feed ourselves and to get at the petroleum down further south at Mariupol, and you basically down in the South Caucasus oil fields. The access to them was down through southern Ukraine. And so Hitler basically, decided to forego taking Moscow before winter, which is the only way he was going to be able to take it, in order to get Ukraine. And that tells you something about just how much is there. And I think you're right that, the IMF and a lot of the sort of Western interests, basically economic, financial, industrial interests, and energy interests in Ukraine are basically prompted by that. The sense, and that would be, and insofar as NATO expansion could be viewed as a sort of adjunct to all of that, then there was a kind of sinister game afoot insofar as that's where we were sort of headed. The sense in which is a silver lining under present circumstances is that's just not going to happen now. I think whatever comes out of, whatever sort of peace agreement or whatever outcome comes from the current war going on there, it's not going to be that, right? The Russians are not going to allow or agree to any sort of final settlement that involves Ukraine being exploited by and used by, Western IMF member countries. But that opens the door to the two sort of somewhat better case scenarios that one might imagine, right? So one thing that one might imagine, and I'm still not sure why this couldn't have happened even in 2014, is remember back in 2014, at the time of what the Russians believe was a coup and what some Western Ukrainians view as a popular uprising, and I just can't adjudicate on that one. But at that time, you might remember that the big struggle was Ukraine going to join a Russian-led economic community, basically the sort of so-called Russian Commonwealth of states, or was it going to join the European Union, right? Which common market, so to speak, was it going to join? And I remember even at the time thinking, well, why does Ukraine have to choose? Why can't it just be a member of both? Why couldn't it be a hybrid country that belongs to both of those economic unions? And that might ultimately lead to some sort of further integration of the Russian bloc of countries with the Western ones, which then might sort of have a salutary influence on where things go even in the West, because the Russians, as you know, and as you will remember, maybe had a really awful experience with IMF-style restructuring and rational privatization and so forth in the 1990s. All these Harvard economists went over there, and they basically just converted the country into a kleptocracy. It was just absolute disaster. And it's hard to imagine many Russian people then being particularly enamored of the idea of Western-style restructuring. And so had Ukraine been able to be a member both of the EU and of the Russian bloc of countries, maybe it could have served as some kind of a sort of conduit of, sort of more sensible thinking from the Eastern side over to the West. Now, I can imagine something like that happening now. I mean, it's probably a starry-eyed, sort of overly sanguine view, but you can imagine one settlement being, all right, how about they get to be a member of both?
Well, I want to jump to SWIFT for a minute, because we're running out of time, and I want to make sure we get this in. So obviously, the Western nations have cut off Russia through the SWIFT cut. This is just to get money out of the freaking ATM machines. I mean, without having access to SWIFT, they can't purchase goods and services outside of Russia, period. They are literally cut off. Now, I don't think Putin is necessarily going to be hurt by this, but the people are. And the idea of sanctions is always with the intention of making the local civilians, the people of the country in theater, to freaking turn on their leaders, to make them have a coup, to make them have a revolution, to make them say no mas, whatever that is, basta, whatever, And so here we are. I don't think we've ever seen sanctions work in that way. Sanctions usually turn people more nationalistic, more supportive of their leaders, seeing the rest of the world attacking them, and that sense of pride and homeland or motherland or whatever starts picking back up. But obviously these kinds of sanctions, they really hurt the regular people.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about what these sanctions are doing and what the central bank's response is.
Yeah, sort of maybe two things are worth highlighting here, Steve. On the one hand, you're of course right that the sanctions are typically sort of aimed at turning the populace against their leadership. And sometimes that works and sometimes it has the contrary effect. It simply makes people feel as though they themselves are being personally attacked, in effect, by this imperial power that's kind of reaching into their own country. And whether the sort of current sort of round of sanctions, even let's say whether the current round of sanctions, absent any kind of pressure valve, would have one effect or the other is kind of hard to tell at the moment. I mean, Putin has been quite masterful over the years at sort of getting the Russian public to sort of identify with him and his position, and just sort of think of this as Russia being screwed by the world, and in particular by the US-led world that's been kind of, and it's not too hard to sort of make people believe that there's something Russophobic in American policy over the last 30 years, because it has been. I mean, how many people have we heard, sort of talking about Putin as some kind of a thug or a dictator or a monster or whatever? Whereas in many ways, I mean, maybe he's sort of losing it now, I don't know. But I mean, for his first 20 years, at least, he was enormously popular in Russia because he was kind of reversing all of the losses that Yeltsin experienced when the West just walked all over him. So whether Putin can kind of keep up that kind of popular sort of support of himself and his position against the West, it's possible that he might. It's maybe possible that there's more dissent, and it's just hard to tell which way that would go, again, absent any pressure valve. But there's the critical caveat. There's a huge pressure valve to let off the pressure that Russia has, and that's China, right? There's at this point, Russia has up to this point been primarily an exporter of petroleum and of unfinished products, basically unfinished resources
Crude.
to the West, in return for, again, manufactured goods, right? But last I checked, China is pretty productive with manufactured goods as well, and it's got a huge border with Russia. And China is in great need of Russian energy resources as well. And as you know, they've been moving closer and closer in recent years, even to the point of almost formalizing a kind of alliance. Now, I do think that the reaction to Russia in the last few days has been a bit more vehement and a bit more unified than anybody was expecting, so that China itself is probably feeling a little bit more leery than it would have felt about being overt in its support for Russia. But that's not to say anything about covert assistance. And it's very easy for me to see President Xi, on the one hand, talking about respecting territorial boundaries and sovereignty and getting a ceasefire as soon as possible, and maybe even kind of meaning that. But at the whole time, being willing, sort of out of eyeshot, so to speak, to do all sorts of trading directly with Russia. And that could just be barter, in effect. I mean, Russia wouldn't need dollars at all, or any dollar-related assets for this. It could just swap oil and other resources for the other goods that it needs from China, and it would just be that simple. I mean, they would have to figure out, exchange rates and so forth, but it would basically just be China-Russia trade. That would be autarkic.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.